I always thought my grandfather was a simple man, a tough, no-nonsense rancher who didn't have time for fairy tales. But when he passed away and I was cleaning out his bedroom, I found a loose floorboard in the back of his closet. Hidden underneath was a leather journal that he had kept secret for 50 years. What I read inside didn't just change how I saw him, it changed everything I thought I knew about the woods surrounding our home. It wasn't a record of cattle or crops. It was a logbook of a decades-long friendship with a creature that science says doesn't exist. If you enjoy stories about the unexplained mysteries of the wild and the secrets kept in the deep timber, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. Now let me tell you what I found in those pages. It was the kind of dry, dusty heat that settles in the Cascades during late August, the summer of 2015. My grandfather had passed 2 weeks prior, leaving behind a sprawling ranch house filled with 80 years of accumulated life. My mother and I were tasked with the clean-out, a somber ritual of sorting memories into keep and donate piles. The house felt heavy and silent without him, the smell of his pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains like a ghost. I was working in his bedroom, clearing out the heavy oak wardrobe, when I noticed a discrepancy in the floorboards near the back of the closet. My grandfather was a man of the earth, a cattle rancher who believed in what he could touch, weigh, and sell. He had no patience for ghost stories or local superstitions. His world was defined by fence lines, calving seasons, and the price of beef. I'd never seen him read a book that wasn't an agricultural manual or a Western novel. He was the kind of man who looked you in the eye and demanded the unvarnished truth, rejecting anything that smelled of fantasy. So finding a secret compartment in his room felt like a violation of the man I thought I knew. The floorboard was loose, priable with the edge of a screwdriver, revealing a dark, dust-choked hollow between the joists. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth usually used for keeping tools dry, was a single heavy object. I pulled it out, the cloth falling away to reveal a thick leather-bound journal, the hide worn smooth by decades of handling. It wasn't a ledger for the ranch. It looked personal, intimate, something protected from the world. My hands trembled as I sat cross-legged on the floor, the weight of the book pressing down on my knees. I opened the cover, the spine cracking with the sound of dry parchment, releasing a scent of old paper and cedar. The first page was dated October 14th, 1962, written in my grandfather's distinct, jagged cursive. The ink was faded to a rusty brown, but the words were pressed hard into the paper, as if written with intense emotion. Today, I met something in the forest that changed everything. It read, "I cannot write its name, only that it exists, and it sees me. God help me, it sees me." I sat there stunned, reading the line over and over, trying to force the words to make sense coming from him. This sounded like the diary of a madman or a poet, not the stoic rancher who taught me how to shoot a rifle. I checked the date again, 1962. He would have been 30 years old, in the prime of his life, sane and sharp as a tack. This wasn't the rambling of a senile mind losing its grip. This was a contemporaneous record of an event that shook him to his core. I flipped through the rest of the pages, the sheer volume of the writing staggering me. It wasn't just a few entries. The journal was filled from front to back, spanning nearly 50 years of his life. There were sketches in the margins, crude but detailed drawings of footprints, hand shapes, and topographical maps of the ranch. He had documented weather patterns, moon phases, and migration routes, applying a scientific rigor to something impossible. The sheer density of the data suggested an obsession that had run parallel to his entire public life. As I skimmed the entries, phrases jumped out at me that made my skin crawl. "The giant returned tonight," read one from 1974. "He brought the smell of the river with him." Another from 1989. "They are moving higher up the ridge to avoid the loggers." He wasn't writing about bears or mountain lions. He was writing about a specific, recurring presence. The tone wasn't fearful. It was respectful, bordering on reverent. He was documenting a relationship with a neighbor I never knew we had. I looked up at the empty room, suddenly feeling very small in the silence of the ranch house. My mother was downstairs packing china, completely unaware that her father had been living a double life. I realized that the man who sat at our dinner table every Sunday talking about the weather and the herd had been carrying a secret the size of a mountain. He had looked out the window at the tree line every night not to check the weather but to check for him. A heavy realization settled over me. This journal wasn't just a diary, it was a confession. He had kept this hidden under the floorboards to protect us, or perhaps to protect the creature from the ridicule of the world. He had taken this truth to his grave, leaving the paper trail behind as a breadcrumb trail for the one person curious enough to look. I was the one who found it, and now the burden of the secret had transferred to me. I took a deep breath, the dust of the closet filling my lungs, and turned back to the very first entry. I needed to know how it started, I needed to know what had turned a hard-nosed cattleman into a secret anthropologist of the unknown. The entry for that day in October 1962 was long, written with a frantic energy that spilled over the margins. As I began to read, the room faded away, and I was transported back 50 years to a cold autumn morning on the fence line. I turned the page carefully, the paper brittle with age, and started reading the entry that marked the moment his world split in two. He wrote that it was a Tuesday, cold and biting, with a frost that clung to the wire fencing he was stretching along the north pasture. He described the mundane labor of the ranch with a rancher's eye, the tension of the come-along tool, the bite of the pliers, the ache in his shoulders. It was a normal day, indistinguishable from 1,000 others, until the wind shifted. It brought a sound from the deep timber that he couldn't place, a noise that didn't belong to the cattle or the coyotes. He described the sound as a low, vibratory moan, something that was felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. It wasn't the sharp cry of an animal in sudden pain. It was the exhausted, rhythmic vocalization of something that had been suffering for hours. He wrote that his dog, a fearless healer named Buster, tucked his tail and hid under the truck, refusing to come out. That was the first sign that something was wrong. My grandfather grabbed his .30-30 rifle from the rack, not because he was hunting, but because the silence that followed the moan felt heavy and threatening. He crossed the pasture and stepped into the tree line, moving from the open light of the field into the shadowed gloom of the old-growth forest. He tracked the sound for a mile, moving quietly over the pine needles, his senses tuned to the frequency of the woods. He described the air getting colder, the smell of musk and wet iron growing stronger with every step. He found signs of a struggle in the brush, snapped saplings, deep gouges in the mud, and blood. Bright arterial blood that was still steaming in the chill air, painting a map of agony on the forest floor. When he reached the small clearing near the creek, he stopped, his brain refusing to accept the visual data it was receiving. He wrote, "I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, trying to claw the bark off a tree." But as he moved closer, the figure turned, and the illusion of the bear shattered instantly. It was a bipedal creature, standing over 7 feet tall, even with its posture hunched in pain. It was covered in dark matted hair that was caked with mud and blood, but its face was bare, revealing skin that looked like weathered leather. The creature was trapped. Its right leg was clamped tight in the jaws of an ancient rusted bear trap, a relic from the fur trading days that someone must have left forgotten in the mud. The steel teeth had bitten deep into the muscle of the calf, grinding against the bone. My grandfather described the injury with clinical precision, noting the swelling and the dark color of the blood, estimating the creature had been caught since the night before. It was exhausted, leaning against a fir tree for support, its massive chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. My grandfather raised his rifle, his finger finding the trigger, his instinct to protect his land kicking in. He assumed it was a predator, a threat to his herd that needed to be put down. But then the creature looked at him. He wrote, "It didn't look at the gun, it looked at my eyes." The gaze wasn't feral, it was amber, intelligent, and filled with a profound, terrifying resignation. It knew what the gun was. It knew what men were, and it was waiting for him to finish what the trap had started. That eye contact broke him. He lowered the rifle, overwhelmed by the realization that he wasn't looking at an animal, but a person. He described the feeling as a sudden shame, a guilt for pointing a weapon at something that was suffering so visibly. He wrote about the internal debate, the voice of reason telling him to walk away, and the voice of conscience telling him he couldn't leave a living thing to die like that. He set the rifle down against a stump, a gesture of peace that felt insane in the moment, and stepped into the clearing with his hands up. The creature flinched, letting out a low, warning growl that vibrated the ground, but it didn't strike. It was too weak, too drained by the loss of blood to fight him. My grandfather approached the trap slowly, talking in a low, steady voice, the same way he calmed a spooked horse. He knelt in the mud beside the massive leg, the smell of the creature burning his nose, a mix of pine, sweat, and something wild. He examined the trap, realizing he needed leverage to open the rusted springs that had been shut for decades. He used a sturdy oak branch as a pry bar, jamming it into the mechanism and heaving with all his strength. He wrote that he was terrified the creature would panic and attack him the moment the pain spiked, but it stayed still. It seemed to understand the mechanics of what he was doing, enduring the agony of the pressure release with a stoic silence that humbled him. When the jaws finally snapped open, the creature yanked its leg free with a speed that blurred the air, collapsing backward into the ferns. My grandfather scrambled back, grabbing his rifle, expecting the attack now that the beast was free. But there was no retaliation. The creature lay there for a moment, massaging the circulation back into its crushed limb, watching him. Then it slowly stood up, towering over him, casting a long shadow across the clearing. It looked at him one last time, a look he described as a heavy measuring stare, and then turned. It limped away into the deep timber, disappearing like smoke, leaving my grandfather alone with a blood-soaked trap and a world that had just gotten infinitely bigger. As I turned the pages, moving from the shock of the early 60s into the routine of the 70s, the tone of the journal shifted remarkably. The frantic, jagged handwriting of the first encounter smoothed out into the calm, methodical script of a man recording the weather or the price of feed. He wasn't writing about a monster anymore. He was documenting a neighbor. The entries became a logbook of visitation, proving that the creature hadn't just fled into the woods to die or disappear. It had come back. And then it came back again, establishing a pattern that would weave through the tapestry of my grandfather's life for the next 3 decades. He noted that the visits weren't random chaos, but followed a rhythm that seemed tied to the seasons and the movement of the land itself. In the spring, when the calving season began, the creature would be spotted on the high ridge, watching the herd with the vigilance of a shepherd. My grandfather wrote, "He never threatens the calves, he counts them." In the deep winter, the tracks would move closer to the homestead, circling the barn and the woodshed, likely drawn by the residual warmth and the smell of the livestock. It was a consistent, deliberate orbit around the ranch, a patrol route that included us in its territory. The descriptions of the creature's movement fascinated me, contradicting everything I had seen in movies about lumbering, clumsy beasts. My grandfather described a liquid grace, a way of moving 800 pounds of mass through dry brush without snapping a twig. He wrote about watching the creature cross a scree slope in 1968, navigating loose rock that would have twisted a horse's ankle, placing its feet with a delicate precision that left barely a trace. It taught him that true strength wasn't about force, it was about control. He began to emulate this in his own walks, learning to move through his own land without disturbing the silence. There were gaps in the log, sometimes spanning months, where the creature would vanish into the deep wilderness, likely following the elk migration or seeking solitude. My grandfather documented these absences with a palpable sense of anxiety, worrying that poachers or old age had finally caught up with his friend. But then a new entry would appear. October 12th. The heavy step returns. The woods feel full again. You could feel the relief bleeding through the ink. The creature was the constant variable in a world that was changing rapidly, a fixed point of wildness that anchored the ranch to history. He began to categorize the sounds, building a lexicon of the creature's vocalizations that went far beyond the terrifying moans of the first night. He described sharp, percussive wood knocks that signaled alerting or location checking, echoing like gunshots across the valley. He wrote about soft, whistling mimics of bird calls used when the creature was close to the house, a safe signal to let him know it was there without alerting the dogs. My grandfather realized that the creature wasn't just making noise. It was speaking a language of utility and emotion, broadcasting its intent to anyone who knew how to listen. One entry from 1971 stood out, detailing a night when a massive summer storm knocked out power to the valley. My grandfather sat on the porch watching the lightning walk across the peaks when he felt the heavy presence beside him in the dark. The creature was standing just beyond the porch railing, soaked by the rain, sharing the shelter of the overhang. They stood together for an hour, 2 solitary males watching the violence of the storm in companionable silence. He wrote, "He fears the thunder, but he trusts the roof. We are both just small things waiting for the sky to clear." Through these pages, I saw my grandfather transforming from a cattleman into a naturalist of the impossible. He stopped carrying his rifle on these walks, realizing that the weapon was an insult to the truce they had formed. He started leaving apples and salt blocks in the clearing by the creek, not as bait for a trap, but as a tithe to the landlord of the forest. He noted that the creature would only take what was offered, never stealing from the garden or the feed bins. It had a code of conduct, a set of rules that it adhered to with a discipline that put most humans to shame. He also documented the physical changes in the creature over the decades, watching time take its toll on the giant just as it did on him. In the 60s, the descriptions were of a prime, dark-furred titan, rippling with muscle and aggression. By the 80s, the entries described silver ticking in the coat, a slower gait, and a heaviness in the eyes. They were aging together, their lives running on parallel tracks, witnessing the slow decline of the wild world around them. My grandfather's handwriting grew shakier as the years went on, mirroring the stiffening joints of the creature he watched. The journal revealed that the creature became his greatest teacher, instructing him in the art of observation. My grandfather wrote about learning to sit perfectly still for hours, mimicking the creature's statue state, until the forest forgot he was there. He learned to smell the weather changes before they crested the ridge, to read the disturbance of a single leaf, to sense the mood of the valley. He wasn't just ranching the land anymore. He was becoming part of it, guided by a mentor that had lived there since the Ice Age. But amidst the observations of nature and movement, there was a shift in the narrative toward the internal. My grandfather began to write about his own flaws, his temper, his impatience, his need for control, and how the creature held a mirror up to them. He hinted at a specific day in 1976 when the dynamic changed from passive observation to an active lesson. The entry started with a confession of anger and ended with a revelation, marking the moment when the Bigfoot decided that the man needed to be schooled not in the ways of the woods, but in the ways of the spirit. The entry from July 14, 1976, was written with a pen that seemed to dig deep into the paper, the ink blotchy as if the hand holding it was still shaking from adrenaline or shame. It was a sweltering afternoon, the kind where the heat shimmering off the metal roof of the workshop distorted the air. My grandfather was trying to rebuild the carburetor on his old steel chainsaw, a temperamental machine that was critical for the winter firewood prep. He described the sweat stinging his eyes, the grease making his fingers slick, and the microscopic screws that refused to seat properly in the threads. He was a man who prided himself on capability, and the machine was making him feel small and incompetent. The frustration built slowly, like pressure in a boiler, until a stripped bolt caused the explosion. He wrote that he felt a white-hot flash of rage when the wrench slipped, tearing the skin on his knuckles. In a fit of temper that he admitted was childish, he stood up and hurled the heavy steel wrench as hard as he could toward the tree line. He shouted a curse that echoed off the valley walls, a raw, ugly sound of human aggression intruding on the peace of the afternoon. He stood there panting, gripping the workbench, waiting for the satisfaction of the outburst to settle, but feeling only a sudden, foolish emptiness. The wrench crashed into the brush with a loud clatter, tearing through leaves and striking wood, then silence rushed back in to fill the void. He expected the birds to start singing again, but the woods remained dead quiet, that heavy, expectant stillness he knew too well. He looked up, wiping the grease and blood from his hand, and saw him. The creature was standing just inside the shade of the old oak tree, maybe 20 yards away. He hadn't made a sound approaching. He had just materialized, drawn by the noise of the man losing control. My grandfather froze, the shame hitting him harder than the heat. He wrote, "I felt like a child caught throwing a tantrum by his father." The creature wasn't looking at him with fear or aggression. He was looking at him with a calm, detached curiosity. He stood perfectly still, his massive arms loose at his sides, radiating a stillness that made my grandfather's frantic energy feel chaotic and wasteful. The contrast was stark. The savage beast was composed and dignified, while the civilized man was violent and loud. It was a silent critique of human nature delivered without a single gesture. Then, the creature did something that changed my grandfather's understanding of intelligence. He slowly walked over to the brush where the wrench had landed, moving with that fluid, rolling gait that made no sound. He bent down, his massive hand disappearing into the ferns, and retrieved the tool. My grandfather gripped the edge of the workbench, wondering if the creature would throw it back, or perhaps keep it as a trophy. But the giant simply looked at the wrench, turning the cold steel over in fingers that were thick as sausages, yet capable of infinite delicacy. He walked toward the workshop, stopping at the edge of the cleared dirt, respecting the invisible boundary of the structure. He didn't toss the tool. He leaned forward and placed it gently on the top of a fence post. He set it down with such extreme care that it didn't even make a clink against the wood. It was a deliberate demonstration of control, a physical rebuke to the violence of the throw. He looked at the wrench, then at my grandfather, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. The message was clear. Force is easy. Control is hard. My grandfather wrote that he stood there for a long time after the creature turned and walked away, staring at the wrench on the fence post. He realized that in the woods, energy is a finite resource, and wasting it on anger is a death sentence. The creature survived because he possessed an infinite well of patience, capable of waiting hours for a deer to step into range or sitting motionless through a storm. My grandfather's rage was a luxury of the modern world, a weakness that made him loud, blind, and stupid. He went back to the workbench, retrieved the wrench, and sat down. He described taking a deep breath, slowing his heart rate, and forcing his hands to stop shaking. He cleaned the threads of the bolt, realigned the carburetor, and turned the screw. It seated perfectly on the first try. He wrote, "The machine didn't change. I did." It was the first real lesson, as he called it, the transfer of a philosophy from the wild to the domestic. He realized that to live in these mountains, he had to adopt the rhythm of the things that lived there first. From that day on, the tone of the journal became more introspective. He started noting instances where he chose patience over force, waiting out a stubborn calf, fixing a broken fence without swearing, sitting on the porch to watch the sunset instead of rushing to finish chores. He credited the creature with teaching him how to be a better man, not through words, but through the example of absolute, unwavering presence. He was learning to quiet the noise in his own head so he could finally hear what the world was trying to tell him. But as I turned the pages to the late 70s, the ink grew darker, the handwriting more jagged again. The peace he had found was fragile, dependent on a secrecy that was becoming harder to keep. He hinted at a night in town, a bottle of whiskey, and a moment of weakness that would threaten to undo 20 years of trust. The lesson of patience had stuck, but the lesson of humility hadn't taken root deep enough to save him from his own ego. The next entry was dated November 1979, and it began with a sentence that made my stomach drop. "I have betrayed him, and I fear he knows." The entry for November 14th, 1979 was stained with circular watermarks that looked suspiciously like teardrops or spilled bourbon. My grandfather recounted a night at the Rusty Spur, a local dive bar where the air was thick with smoke and the ego of deer hunters. He had gone in for a quiet drink to escape the loneliness of the ranch, but the whiskey loosened his tongue and his pride got the better of him. A group of out-of-towners were bragging about tracking a massive bear, laughing about how nothing in these woods could outsmart them. Stung by their arrogance, my grandfather leaned in and whispered, "You boys haven't seen anything until you've seen the giant on my ridge." It was a momentary lapse, a flash of vanity where he wanted to be the man with the biggest secret in the room. He told them about the tracks, the size of the stride, and the specific hollow near the creek where the creature bedded down. He wrote, "The moment the words left my mouth, I felt a sickness in my gut, like I had just sold a friend for copper coins." The hunters didn't laugh. They went quiet, their eyes lighting up with the greedy shine of men seeing a trophy. They bought him another round, pumping him for details, and in his stupor, he gave them the map to the sanctuary. The consequences arrived 3 days later, not as a subtle inquiry, but as an invasion. A convoy of trucks with out-of-state plates rolled up his driveway, men pouring out with high-powered rifles, bear dogs, and spotlights. They didn't ask for permission. They claimed they were tracking a rogue predator that had crossed property lines. My grandfather stood on his porch, hungover and horrified, watching them swarm into the timber he had protected for 20 years. The silence of the forest was shattered by the baying of hounds and the shouting of men who saw the woods only as a battlefield. He tried to stop them, threatening to call the sheriff, but they waved him off, disappearing into the dense brush where he knew the creature was hiding. He spent the next 3 nights awake, sitting on the porch with his head in his hands, listening for the gunshot that would end his life's meaning. Every bark of a dog, every crack of a branch, sounded like an accusation. He wrote, "I prayed for rain, for snow, for anything to wash away the scent and hide him. I prayed that my betrayal hadn't killed the only magic left in this world." The hunters left after a week, frustrated and empty-handed, cursing the terrain and the crazy old man who sent them on a wild goose chase. They had found tracks that terrified them, massive prints that confused the dogs, but the creature had vanished. He had sensed the intrusion long before they breached the tree line and had ghosted away into the high alpine, retreating from the stupidity of men. The trucks drove away, leaving deep ruts in the mud and a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wild. It was the dead, hollow silence of an empty room. For 2 months, the ranch was a graveyard. There were no wood knocks, no whistles, no tracks near the barn. The winter of 1979 descended with a brutal cold, but the heavy step didn't return to the woodshed for warmth. My grandfather walked the perimeter every day, leaving apples that rotted in the snow, calling out into the gray twilight. He wrote about the crushing weight of his guilt, the certainty that he had broken the unspoken pact. He believed the creature had either migrated to a safer range, or worse, had died of exposure while hiding from the guns. He stopped carrying a weapon entirely during this time, a penance for the violence he had invited onto the land. He worked the ranch like a robot, mechanically feeding the cattle, his eyes always scanning the tree line for a shadow that wasn't there. He realized that the creature wasn't just a curiosity. It was the witness to his life, the other half of a conversation he had been having for 2 decades. Without the giant, the mountains felt just like piles of rock, stripped of their spirit. He ended his entries from December with a single recurring line, "I am sorry. I am so sorry." Then came the night of February 2nd, 1980. A heavy snowstorm had buried the valley, and my grandfather was in the barn, breaking ice in the water troughs for the horses. The wind was howling around the eaves, masking all sound, but he felt that familiar prickle on the back of his neck, the static charge of being watched. He turned slowly, holding his breath, afraid to hope. Standing in the open doorway of the barn, framed by the swirling white of the blizzard, was the giant. He looked thinner, his coat shaggy and unkempt, showing the toll of 2 months in the high exposure. He stood there, snow melting on his shoulders, looking at my grandfather with those deep amber eyes. There was no anger in his stance, no baring of teeth. He simply looked at the man, then at the rifle rack on the wall, which was empty, and then back to the man. He knew. He knew that the invasion had stopped, and he knew that the man was defenseless. It was a moment of judgment that could have ended in violence, but instead, it ended in grace. The creature stepped into the barn, shaking the snow from his fur like a massive dog. He walked over to the hayloft ladder, picked up a fresh bale of alfalfa, and tossed it effortlessly into the horse stall, a chore my grandfather usually struggled with. It was a peace offering, a return to the routine, a signal that the work continued. My grandfather wrote, "I fell to my knees in the straw and wept." He didn't comfort me, but he didn't leave. He just stood there, breathing the same air, letting me know that mistakes are human, but the bond is wilder than that. The forgiveness wasn't spoken, but it was absolute. The creature had weighed the 20 years of protection against the 1 week of betrayal and decided the man was worth a second chance. But the dynamic had shifted. The creature was now the wary one, the senior partner who understood the dangers of the world better than the man did. My grandfather swore a blood oath in his journal that night, a vow of absolute secrecy that he kept until the day he died. And he would need that trust, because the creature wasn't just returning to the ranch. He was preparing to bring the rest of his world with him. The journal entries for the summer of 1985 crackled with a new kind of energy. The handwriting less rigid, the ink flowing faster. My grandfather described a shift in the giant's behavior starting in June. He was restless, pacing the perimeter of the clearing, constantly looking back into the deep timber as if waiting for a signal. He stopped eating the apples right away, instead gathering them into his massive hands and carrying them off into the darkness. My grandfather sensed that the creature was preparing for something, widening the circle of trust. But he wasn't prepared for the magnitude of what stepped out of the trees on the evening of July 4th. It was twilight, the air heavy with the scent of clover and cooling earth, fireflies just starting to blink in the tall grass. My grandfather was sitting on the porch steps, smoking his pipe, when the giant appeared at the edge of the yard. But he didn't come alone. He stopped at the fence line and turned his massive body sideways, making a soft, chirping sound that my grandfather had never heard before. It was a coaxing sound, gentle and reassuring, directed at the shadows behind him. He wrote. My heart stopped. I realized in that moment that I had only been seeing half the picture. A second figure emerged from the gloom, stepping hesitantly into the fading light. She, and he was certain immediately it was a female, was smaller, perhaps 6.5 feet tall, with a sleeker build and fur that was a lighter tawny brown. She moved with a nervous, fluid grace, staying glued to the giant's side, using his bulk as a physical shield against the terrifying sight of the human. She stared at my grandfather with wide, fearful eyes, her hands twitching at her sides, ready to bolt at the first sudden movement. The giant placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of profound tenderness that anchored her to the spot. My grandfather froze, letting his pipe go out, afraid that even the smoke would spook the newcomer. He witnessed a silent conversation between them, a series of subtle glances, shifts in posture, and low-frequency hums that vibrated in the air. The giant was vouching for him. He was telling her that this specific human, this small, aging rancher, was part of the landscape and not a threat. It was an introduction, a formal presentation of his kin to the only other being he communicated with. She took a few tentative steps forward, drawn by the bucket of oats and apples my grandfather had left by the gate. She moved differently than the male. She was constantly scanning the sky and the horizon, her vigilance dialed up to 11. When she reached the bucket, she didn't eat. She picked up an apple, smelled it, and then looked at the giant for confirmation. He nodded, a distinct human dip of the chin, and she took a bite. My grandfather wrote, I felt like I was holding my breath for 10 minutes. To be trusted by the king is one thing. To be trusted with the queen is a burden I'm not sure I'm worthy of. The dynamic of the ranch changed overnight. The solitary visits ended, replaced by the arrival of the pair. They would sit together on the ridgeline in the evenings, grooming each other with delicate fingers, removing burrs and ticks in a ritual of intimacy that made my grandfather feel like a voyeur. He described hearing them talk in the dark, a complex interplay of whistles, grunts, and murmurs that sounded like a language he was just on the edge of understanding. It humanized them in a way the solitary encounters never could. They had relationships, they had affection, they had a society of two. The female, whom he started referring to as Sheba in the notes, eventually warmed to him, though she never let her guard down completely. She would watch him work in the garden, fascinated by the way he pulled weeds or staked tomatoes. One afternoon, he left a basket of fresh vegetables on the fence post, and he watched from the window as she inspected it. She didn't just dump it out, she picked through it, selecting the carrots and leaving the turnips, displaying a preference and a personality that delighted him. He wrote, "She has a sweet tooth. He likes the salt. They are as different as any married couple I've ever known." The journal entries from this period were the happiest in the book. My grandfather wasn't just a lonely widower on a failing ranch anymore. He was the caretaker of a sanctuary. He wrote about the joy of seeing them play, yes, play, chasing each other through the snow in the winter, or splashing in the creek during the summer heat. He realized that their lives weren't just a grim struggle for survival. There was joy there, and humor, and love. The ranch became a safe harbor for a family that had likely been running from encroachment for decades. He also noted the protective instinct expanding. When a pack of coyotes came too close to the house one night, yipping and howling, the male didn't just roar. The pair coordinated a pincer movement to drive them off, moving with military precision. They weren't just protecting themselves. They were clearing the threat from his territory too. He was part of the pack now, a strange, hairless member of the clan who provided the apples and kept the other humans away. But as I turned the pages into the late 1990s, the exuberant tone began to fade, replaced by a quieter, more somber observation. The entries became less about the new discoveries and more about the slow, inevitable creep of time. He noted that the male was taking longer to stand up after sitting, that the female's muzzle was turning gray. The playfulness slowed down, replaced by long periods of stillness. My grandfather was aging too, his handwriting becoming shaky and spider-like, mirroring the decline he was witnessing in the woods. The golden age of the family was passing, yielding to the twilight years. As I read through the entries from the late 1990s and into the new millennium, the tone of the journal shifted from the excitement of discovery to a heavy autumnal melancholia. The vibrant, jagged handwriting of my grandfather's youth smoothed out into the shaky, spiderweb script of an old man fighting tremors. He wasn't chronicling the adventures of the wild anymore. He was documenting the slow, inevitable decay of living things. He wrote about the long winters, not just as weather events, but as a metaphor for the season of life they had all entered. The energy of the ranch had quieted down, the cattle sold off, leaving just 3 old souls, the man, the male, and the female, waiting out the clock in the high country. The physical transformation of the giant was heartbreaking to read. My grandfather described the once jet black coat turning a dusty iron gray, starting at the muzzle and spreading down the back like frost. The massive, fluid stride that had once cleared fences without breaking rhythm was replaced by a stiff, rolling gait that betrayed bad hips and aching joints. He wrote, "He groans now when he sits down, a sound I know well because I make it too. We are 2 old machines with rusted gears, complaining about the cold together." The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by a fragile dignity that commanded even more respect. Sheba, the female, faded even faster. Her visits became sporadic, limited to the warmest days of summer when the travel was easiest on her bones. My grandfather noted that she looked thin, her tawny coat losing its luster, her eyes clouded with the milky haze of cataracts. The giant was fiercely protective of her, moving slower to stay by her side, often offering her his arm for support on the uneven ground. It was a display of devotion that transcended species, a husband caring for his failing wife with a tenderness that shamed the humans who abandoned their own elderly. The interactions changed from active engagement to passive companionship. The days of throwing apples or inspecting tools were over. Now they simply sat. My grandfather would sit on the porch in his rocker, and the pair would sit just beyond the fence line in the tall grass. They would spend hours like that, motionless statues watching the sun move across the valley, sharing a silence that didn't need to be filled. He wrote, "We don't need to trade secrets anymore. We are just witnessing the world while we are still part of it. It is enough just to not be alone in the dark." My grandfather's own decline mirrored theirs, a parallel decay that linked their fates even tighter. He wrote about his arthritis, his failing heart, his fear of the nursing home that my mother was starting to suggest. He resisted leaving the ranch not because of pride, but because he couldn't bear the thought of the giant coming down to the house and finding it empty. He was the anchor, the keeper of the lighthouse, and he was terrified that if he extinguished the light, his friends would be lost in the storm. The ranch wasn't property. It was a promise he was struggling to keep. One entry from 2004 was particularly poignant, describing a harsh winter where the snow was too deep for the old creatures to navigate easily. My grandfather, despite his doctor's orders, dragged a sled of hay and apples a mile into the woods because he knew they couldn't make it to the barn. He found them huddled in a thicket, shivering, too weak to forage. He didn't write about their majesty that day. He wrote about their vulnerability. "They looked at me with eyes that were tired," he penned. "Not hungry, just tired. I realized then that nature is cruelest to the strong who live too long. Then, in 2008, the female stopped coming entirely. There was no body found, no dramatic goodbye, just an emptiness in the space beside the giant where she used to stand. The male continued to visit, but he was a ghost of his former self, moving with a heavy, listless sorrow that was palpable even through the written words. He would stand at the edge of the yard, looking at the spots where she used to sit, letting out low, mournful vocalizations that sounded like a whale song dying in the air. My grandfather mourned her too, wearing a black armband for a month, grieving a creature he had never touched but loved deeply. The solitude returned, but it was different now. It was the shared isolation of two widowers. The giant spent less time patrolling the perimeter and more time sitting close to the house, seeking the proximity of the only other living thing that remembered her. My grandfather described nights where he would read aloud from his books on the porch, his voice cracking, just to provide a tether of sound for the creature hiding in the dark. They were holding on to each other, bracing against the inevitable slide into oblivion. As the journal neared its end, the entries became focused on the future, specifically the terrifying uncertainty of what would happen after the end. My grandfather's anxiety spiked. He worried about developers, about hunters, about the new neighbors moving in down the valley who owned drones and thermal cameras. He realized that his secrecy, which had protected them for 50 years, was now a liability. If he died without passing on the torch, the creatures would be defenseless against a world that had gotten faster, louder, and crueler. The final pages of the journal were written with a different pen, the ink bold and dark, as if he had summoned the last of his strength to leave a record. He wasn't writing for himself anymore. He was writing for an audience. He knew his time was up. He mentioned the pains in his chest, the shortness of breath, and he knew the giant was fading too. He had to make a choice: let the secret die with him and hope for the best, or break his silence to ensure the protection continued. He chose to write a legacy, a manual for the next guardian, hoping that blood would call to blood. I closed the journal, the heavy leather cover settling with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel falling in a quiet courtroom. The room felt different now, charged with the static of a 50-year-old secret that had just been transferred to my shoulders. My grandfather hadn't just left me a book. He had left me a manual, a deed to a responsibility that I hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The final entry wasn't a goodbye. It was a direct instruction, written in a hand that knew it was running out of time. "I am leaving this record for whoever finds it," he had written, "not as proof for the world, but as an invitation to the one who has my blood. The mountains remember. Do not let them forget us." I sat there on the floorboards for a long time, listening to the sounds of my mother packing boxes downstairs, unaware that the inheritance she was boxing up was worthless compared to what I held in my lap. I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life, a fork in the road between the comfortable ignorance of modern life and the wild, impossible truth of the ranch. I could burn the book, sell the land to the developers circling like vultures, and go back to my city apartment. Or I could walk out that door and see if the old man was still waiting for the next watchman to arrive. The decision was made before I even stood up. I slipped the journal into my backpack, terrified that even the air in the room might degrade the paper. I walked downstairs, grabbed my coat and a bag of the red apples my grandfather always kept in the cellar, the specific variety the journal said he preferred. I told my mother I needed to check the fence line one last time, a lie that felt heavy on my tongue, but necessary. I stepped out onto the porch, the same porch where they had weathered the storm together in '71, and looked at the tree line. It looked different now, not like a wall of wood, but like a curtain waiting to be pulled back. I walked the path described in the 1985 entries, following the faint, overgrown game trail that led to the high ridge overlooking the creek. The woods were silent, the heat of the afternoon settling into the cool shadows of the evening, the light filtering through the canopy in shafts of gold dust. I found the specific stump mentioned in the journal, a massive, rot-resistant cedar stump with a hollow in the center. It was empty, filled only with dry leaves and spider webs, looking abandoned. A pang of doubt hit me. Maybe he was gone. Maybe the journal was a eulogy for a creature that had already passed into the earth. But then I saw it, a subtle, deliberate marker that a casual hiker would have missed entirely. Balanced on the edge of the stump was a single white river stone, placed with a precision that defied gravity. It was the signal my grandfather had described, the "I am here" marker used by the giant when he was waiting. The stone was free of dust, meaning it had been placed recently, perhaps this very morning. The realization sent a jolt of electricity through my nervous system. He wasn't gone. He was still patrolling the perimeter, waiting to see if the void left by my grandfather would be filled. I placed 3 apples in the hollow of the stump, arranging them in a triangle just as the journal instructed, a sign of peace and offering. I stood back, my heart hammering against my ribs, and tried to project the calm that my grandfather had spent decades mastering. "I'm here," I whispered into the trees, feeling foolish and terrified at the same time. "I'm his grandson. I'm taking the watch." The wind rustled the leaves, a gentle sigh that seemed to carry my voice up the slope, delivering the message to the ears that I knew were listening. I waited for an hour, the sun dipping below the ridge, turning the sky a bruised purple. I was about to turn back, accepting that trust takes time, when I heard it. A heavy rhythmic snapping of branches from deep in the timber, moving parallel to my position. It wasn't the frantic scuttle of a deer. It was the slow, measured tread of something that owned the ground it walked on. The sound stopped just inside the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, hidden by the density of the brush. I didn't see him clearly, not that day. I saw a shadow that was too tall and too broad to be a tree, a patch of darkness that blocked out the twilight. I saw the glint of amber eyes reflecting the last of the light, hovering 8 feet off the ground, staring at me with an intensity that weighed tons. He was old. I could tell by the way he leaned against the tree, favoring his left hip, the same way my grandfather had. He was assessing me, measuring the cut of my jib against the memory of the man he had loved. He let out a low, vibrating hum, a sound I recognized from the journal as the family signal. It resonated in my chest, a physical frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to my marrow. He wasn't rejecting me. He was acknowledging the transition, accepting the new keeper of the sanctuary. He stayed there until I turned to leave, a silent sentinel guarding my retreat, ensuring I made it back to the house safely. I walked back down the trail, tears streaming down my face, knowing that my life in the city was over. I never sold the ranch. I moved in that autumn, taking over the repairs, the fences, and the secret. I sit on the porch now in the evenings, reading aloud from the new books I've bought, knowing that somewhere in the dark, an old giant is listening. The journal sits on my desk, open to a new page, where my own handwriting begins the next chapter. The grandfather is gone, and the giant is fading, but the pact holds. As long as I have breath in my body, these woods will remain a quiet place, a safe harbor for the things the world has forgotten how to see.